The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Prince William adjusted his navy blazer for the third time. His hands trembled slightly, a nervous habit that had followed him since childhood. Beside him, Catherine smoothed down her elegant cream dress, her own anxiety barely concealed beneath her practiced royal composure. Today was different from their usual engagements. Today they weren't opening a hospital wing or attending a charity gala. Today, they were about to step through a door that would change everything they thought they knew about their role as future monarchs. The invitation had arrived 3 weeks earlier, written on simple white paper with no royal seal or official letterhead. Just an address in East London and a request that they come alone, without their usual security detail or press photographers. The message was signed by Margaret Thompson, a name neither William nor Catherine recognized, but something about the handwritten note felt urgent and deeply personal. Catherine had been the first to suggest they should go. She remembered the countless letters they received from people across the Commonwealth, stories of struggle and hope that often moved her to tears in the privacy of their apartment at Kensington Palace. But this letter felt different. Margaret hadn't asked for money or royal patronage. She had simply asked them to witness something, to understand what it meant to serve not from a palace balcony, but from the ground up. William had been more hesitant. His father, now King Charles, had always emphasized the importance of protocol and proper channels. Royal visits were planned months in advance, with security sweeps and careful coordination with local authorities. But as he read Margaret's letter, again that evening, something in her words resonated with the part of him that had always felt the weight of his future crown as both privilege and burden. The drive through London had been surreal. Without their usual motorcade, they traveled in a simple black car, watching the city wake up around them. Catherine pressed her face to the window, observing the early morning commuters hurrying to catch buses and trains. These were their future subjects, but how often did they really see them like this, unguarded and natural in their daily lives? The address led them to a modest community center in Tower Hamlets, its brick facade weathered but well-maintained. A small sign read, "Hope Haven Community Kitchen," and through the windows they could see people moving about inside, preparing for what looked like a busy day. William parked the car across the street, and for a moment both he and Catherine sat in silence, gathering their courage. Margaret Thompson turned out to be a woman in her 60s, with silver hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and kind eyes that seemed to hold decades of stories. She greeted them at the side entrance with a gentle smile, as if royal visitors were an everyday occurrence. Her handshake was firm, her voice warm, but matter-of-fact. She led them through a narrow hallway lined with children's artwork and community notices. The smell of fresh bread and cooking vegetables filled the air, mixing with the sound of voices and laughter from the main hall. Margaret walked with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where she belonged and what she was meant to do. As they approached the main dining area, Margaret paused and turned to face them. Her expression grew serious, almost protective. She explained that Hope Haven had been serving the community for 15 years, providing not just meals, but a place of dignity and connection for people facing their hardest times. Some visitors were homeless, others were families struggling to make ends meet, and many were elderly people who came as much for the company as for the food. What Margaret wanted them to understand, she said, was that real service wasn't about cutting ribbons or making speeches. It was about showing up consistently, about seeing people not as causes to champion, but as individuals with names and stories and dreams that mattered. She had invited them not to observe from a distance, but to participate, to serve alongside. The volunteers who came here every day, not because they had to, but because they chose to. Catherine felt her heart racing as Margaret opened the door to the dining hall. The room was bustling with activity as volunteers set up tables and arranged chairs. Some were teenagers, Others were retirees, and many looked like ordinary working people who had chosen to spend their morning helping others. None of them seemed to notice the royal couple's arrival. They were too focused on their tasks. William watched as a young man carefully arranged flowers on each table, taking pride in making the space beautiful for the guests who would soon arrive. An elderly volunteer hummed while she folded napkins, her movements efficient and practiced. This wasn't charity work performed for recognition or praise. This was love in action, and it was happening in a way that neither William nor Catherine had ever witnessed before. Margaret handed them each a volunteer apron and explained their roles for the morning. Catherine would help serve breakfast while William would work in the kitchen preparing meals for the afternoon service. There would be no photographers to capture their good deeds, no press releases to announce their visit. They would simply be two more pairs of hands helping to feed their community. As Catherine tied her apron strings, she felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded her of her first official royal engagement years earlier. But this felt more real somehow, more connected to the reasons she had fallen in love with William and accepted the responsibility that came with marrying into the royal family. This was about service in its purest form. The first guests would arrive in 30 minutes, Margaret explained. Many would be people facing challenges that William and Catherine had only read about in briefing papers or heard described in formal presentations. Today, they would meet these individuals not as distant problems to be solved, but as neighbors to be welcomed and served. As the preparation continued around them, William and Catherine exchanged glances across the bustling room. They both sensed that something significant was about to begin, though neither could have predicted how profoundly this morning would change their understanding of what it truly meant to serve others. The door to Hope Haven had opened, and through it, they were about to discover a new way of being royal. The first guest to walk through the doors of Hope Haven was an elderly man named Arthur, his weathered hands gripping a walking stick carved from dark wood. His clothes were clean but worn, and he moved with the careful dignity of someone who had learned to navigate the world despite its challenges. Margaret greeted him by name, asking about his grandson's football match from the previous weekend. Arthur's face lit up as he shared the news of a winning goal, and Catherine watched this exchange with growing awareness of how much these personal connections mattered. Catherine positioned herself behind the serving counter, her hands initially clumsy with the large ladles and serving spoons. The first few portions she attempted were either too small or awkwardly arranged on the plates, but as more guests arrived, she began to find her rhythm. Each person who approached the counter brought their own story written in their eyes and posture. There was Maria, a young mother with two small children clinging to her coat, who whispered, "Thank you," in accented English. Behind her came James, a veteran who walked with a pronounced limp, but whose military bearing remained unmistakable. What struck Catherine most powerfully was how the volunteers interacted with each guest. There was no pity in their voices, no condescending kindness. Instead, there was genuine warmth and respect. Volunteers asked about jobs and health concerns, remembered names and personal details from previous visits, and treated everyone who walked through the door as valued members of a community rather than recipients of charity. In the kitchen, William found himself working alongside Danny, a local plumber who had been volunteering at Hope Haven for 3 years. Danny had initially come to the center as a guest during a particularly difficult period when work was scarce and his family was struggling. Now, every Saturday morning, he arrived early to help prepare meals for others facing similar challenges. As they chopped vegetables together, Danny shared his philosophy that helping others had helped him regain his sense of purpose and self-worth. William had always understood intellectually that people could face temporary hardships, but working beside Danny gave him a visceral understanding of how thin the line could be between stability and crisis. Danny wasn't different from William's friends or colleagues in any fundamental way. He was articulate, hard-working, and devoted to his family. The circumstances that had brought him to Hope Haven as a guest could happen to anyone, and his journey from receiving help to providing it illustrated something profound about human resilience and community support. The morning rush brought a steady stream of guests, each carrying their own invisible burdens and hopes. Catherine learned to recognize the regulars who came in with confident familiarity, greeting volunteers and finding their preferred seats. But she also noticed the newcomers who lingered uncertainly near the entrance, unsure of the protocols, or worried about being judged. Margaret had trained the volunteers to be especially gentle with first-time visitors, offering them guidance and reassurance without making them feel singled out or embarrassed. One such newcomer was Sarah, a woman, about Catherine's age, who approached the serving line with her teenage daughter. Both were dressed neatly, but Catherine could see the tension in Sarah's shoulders and the way her daughter kept her eyes fixed on the floor. When Catherine handed Sarah her plate, their eyes met briefly, and Catherine saw a flash of recognition followed immediately by mortification. Sarah realized she was being served by the future Queen of England, and her face flushed with embarrassment and shame. Catherine's instinct was to say something reassuring, to bridge the awkward moment with kind words. But she remembered Margaret's guidance about treating everyone with the same natural respect, neither highlighting differences nor pretending they didn't exist. Instead, she simply smiled warmly and asked if Sarah would like extra vegetables for her daughter. The moment passed, and Sarah moved to find a table, but Catherine carried the weight of that encounter with her as she continued serving. Throughout the morning, William and Catherine began to understand the intricate ecosystem of support that Margaret had built at Hope Haven. It wasn't just about providing free meals. The center offered a bulletin board where people could post job openings and housing opportunities. Volunteers included a retired teacher who offered informal literacy classes and a nurse who provided basic health advice. There was even a corner where children could do homework while their parents ate, supervised by volunteers who understood that education was often the key to breaking cycles of poverty. The stories that emerged throughout the morning painted a complex picture of modern Britain that was very different from the one William and Catherine typically encountered in their official roles. There were families where parents worked multiple jobs but still struggled to afford housing in London's expensive market. There were elderly people whose pensions didn't stretch far enough to cover both heating and food during winter months. There were young people aging out of foster care who lacked the family networks that most people took for granted. But alongside these challenges, there were also stories of incredible strength and mutual support. Catherine met a woman named Priya, who had arrived in London as a refugee 5 years earlier and now worked as a translator, helping other newcomers navigate government services and healthcare systems. She still came to Hope Haven occasionally. Not because she needed the meals, but because the community had become like family to her during her most vulnerable period. William was particularly moved by his conversation with Tom, a man in his 40s, who had experienced homelessness for several years following a series of personal crises. Tom now had stable housing and a part-time job, but he continued to volunteer at Hope Haven because he wanted to give back to the place that had literally saved his life. Tom's insights about the systemic issues that contributed to homelessness were more nuanced and practical than anything William had read in government reports or policy briefings. As the breakfast service wound down and volunteers began cleaning up, William and Catherine found themselves reluctant to leave. The morning had challenged their assumptions about poverty, service, and community in ways that felt both uncomfortable and necessary. They had always known that their future roles would require them to serve others, but they had understood that service primarily in terms of official duties, public appearances, and charitable patronage. Here at Hope Haven, they had witnessed service as a daily practice of showing up for each other without fanfare or recognition. They had seen how dignity could be preserved even in moments of great need, and how community could be built through consistent acts of care and respect. Most importantly, they had begun to understand that effective service required not just good intentions, but deep listening and genuine relationship building. Margaret found them both in the kitchen as they finished washing the last of the morning's dishes. She could see in their faces that the morning had affected them profoundly, though she wasn't surprised. Over the years, she had witnessed many volunteers experience similar revelations when they first engaged directly with people whose lives were different from their own. The question was always what people would do with their new understanding once they left Hope Haven and returned to their regular lives. After the breakfast service ended, Margaret invited William and Catherine to join her for tea in a small office behind the kitchen. The room was cramped but comfortable, with mismatched furniture and walls covered with thank you cards, children's drawings, and photographs of community events spanning many years. Margaret poured tea from a chipped pot that looked like it had been serving Hope Haven for decades, and the simple ritual felt more meaningful than any formal reception either Royal had ever attended. Margaret began sharing the story of how Hope Haven had started, and her words painted a picture of gradual growth born from genuine need and community response. 15 years earlier, she had been working as a social worker when she noticed that many of her clients were struggling with food insecurity. Government programs existed, but they were often difficult to navigate and didn't address the social isolation that made people's problems worse. Margaret had started with a simple idea. What if there was a place where people could eat together with dignity, where they could be part of a community rather than just recipients of aid? The first meals had been served in Margaret's own living room to fewer than 10 people. Word spread quietly through networks of social workers, healthcare providers, and community organizations. People came initially for the food, but they returned for the connections they made. Volunteers emerged organically from among the guests, themselves, people who had been helped and wanted to help others in turn. What had started as emergency food assistance had evolved into something much more comprehensive, a place where people could rebuild their sense of belonging and purpose. Catherine found herself thinking about her own charitable work as Margaret spoke. She had always tried to be thoughtful and engaged in her royal patronages, but she realized that much of her involvement had been structured around events and appearances rather than sustained relationship building. She had met many inspiring people and supported important causes, but she had rarely had the opportunity to work alongside people in the intimate, ongoing way that she had witnessed at Hope Haven. William was struck by how Margaret had identified a need in her community and simply begun addressing it, without waiting for official permission or institutional support. His own approach to social issues had been shaped by his position within established systems and protocols. He was learning to work within existing charitable organizations and government programs, but Margaret had created something entirely new because existing solutions weren't adequate for the people she wanted to serve. Margaret seemed to sense their internal reflections, and she gently steered the conversation toward the broader implications of what they had observed. She explained that Hope Haven was just one example of grassroots community organizing happening all across Britain, often invisible to media attention or government recognition. In neighborhoods throughout the country, ordinary people were creating extraordinary solutions to address local needs, from community gardens that provided fresh food in food deserts to informal networks that supported elderly people aging in place. What these initiatives had in common, Margaret explained, was that they emerged from within communities rather than being imposed from outside. They were sustainable because they were owned and operated by the people they served. They were effective because they addressed not just immediate practical needs, but also deeper human needs for connection, purpose, and dignity. And they were innovative because they weren't constrained by existing institutional frameworks or bureaucratic limitations. Catherine asked about the challenges Margaret faced in sustaining Hope Haven, and Margaret's response was both honest and pragmatic. Funding was always a concern, but more significant was the challenge of preventing the center from becoming institutionalized in ways that might compromise its community-driven character. Well-meaning donors sometimes wanted to impose their own ideas about how the center should operate. Government officials occasionally offered support that came with regulatory requirements that would fundamentally change Hope Haven's approach. The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the office door. A young woman named Lisa peeked in, apologizing for the interruption, but explaining that she needed Margaret's advice about a family situation. Margaret immediately invited Lisa to join them, introducing her as one of Hope Haven's most dedicated volunteers and a student at a nearby university studying social policy. Lisa's presence shifted the dynamic of the conversation in ways that surprised William and Catherine. She spoke about her volunteer work with the analytical framework of her academic training, but also with the emotional intelligence that came from direct experience working with people facing complex challenges. Her insights about the gaps in existing social services were informed by both textbook knowledge and real-world observation. What impressed William most was how Lisa challenged some of Margaret's assumptions while still showing deep respect for her experience and leadership. This wasn't the deferential dynamic he was accustomed to in his interactions with staff and advisors. Instead, it was a genuine collaboration between people who brought different perspectives and skills to shared goals. Lisa had grown up in the neighborhood surrounding Hope Haven, and she described how the center had affected the broader community over the years. Property values had stabilized as the area became known for strong community connections rather than social problems. Local businesses had thrived as Hope Haven guests became regular customers once their situations improved. Children who had eaten meals at the center while their families faced hard times were now volunteering as teenagers, creating continuity across generations. But Lisa also spoke candidly about the limitations of community-based solutions to systemic problems. Hope Haven could provide meals and community support, but it couldn't address the underlying economic policies that made housing unaffordable for working families. It could help individuals develop job skills and build networks, but it couldn't create the well-paying employment opportunities that people needed to achieve genuine economic security. This led to a discussion about the relationship between grassroots, community work, and broader policy change. Margaret believed firmly that community organizing had to precede policy reform because politicians needed to understand what was actually happening in people's lives before they could create effective solutions. Lisa argued that community work and policy advocacy needed to happen simultaneously because individual stories of suffering became meaningful only when they were connected to systematic analysis and political action. Catherine found this debate fascinating because it touched on questions she had been grappling with in her own role. As future queen, she would have limited ability to engage directly in political advocacy, but she would have significant platform and influence that could be used to amplify community voices and draw attention to effective grassroots solutions. The challenge would be finding ways to use her position to support community-driven work without overshadowing it or co-opting it for royal purposes. William was thinking about similar questions from a different angle. His future role would require him to work with government officials and policymakers, but his morning at Hope Haven had shown him how much he could learn from spending time with people who were developing practical solutions to social problems. He wondered whether there might be ways to create more formal connections between grassroots community work and institutional decision-making. As their conversation continued, William and Catherine began to realize that their visit to Hope Haven wasn't just about learning new things or having an inspiring experience. It was about fundamentally reconsidering what their roles as future monarchs could become. They had always understood that they would need to serve the public, but they had thought primarily in terms of ceremonial functions and charitable patronage. Margaret and Lisa were showing them a different model of leadership, one based on deep listening, sustained relationship building, and genuine collaboration with communities. This wasn't about providing help from a position of superior resources or authority. Instead, it was about recognizing that every person had something valuable to contribute and that effective solutions emerged from collective wisdom rather than individual expertise. The afternoon light was fading outside Margaret's small office window, and William and Catherine knew they would need to return to their official responsibilities soon. But neither felt ready to leave. The conversations they were having felt more substantive and meaningful than many of the briefings and meetings that filled their regular schedules. Margaret suggested they spend their final hour at Hope Haven, meeting with some of the afternoon volunteers who would be arriving soon to prepare for the evening meal service. This second shift brought a different energy to the center, and William and Catherine were curious to see how the dynamics would change as new people joined the community space. The afternoon volunteers included several people they hadn't met earlier, including a group of teenagers from a nearby secondary school who came to Hope Haven as part of a community service program that had evolved far beyond its original academic requirements. These young people arrived with the easy familiarity of regular volunteers, immediately beginning their tasks while chatting with Margaret about school, family, and neighborhood news. Catherine was particularly drawn to a 16-year-old named Aisha, whose confidence and natural leadership skills were immediately apparent. Aisha had been volunteering at Hope Haven for 2 years, initially because her teacher had required community service hours for a citizenship class. But she had continued long after fulfilling the academic requirement because she had discovered both a passion for community work and a talent for connecting with people from different backgrounds and age groups. Aisha's perspective on the center's work was shaped by her generation's global awareness and social consciousness. She understood food insecurity and social isolation as symptoms of larger systemic inequalities, but she also believed deeply in the power of individual relationships to create change. Her approach to volunteering combined pragmatic problem-solving with genuine empathy, and she had become particularly skilled at helping other young people feel comfortable and valued when they visited Hope Haven with their families. William found himself in conversation with Robert, a recently retired teacher who had begun volunteering at Hope Haven as a way to stay connected to his community after leaving his career in education. Robert brought a different kind of energy to the work, with decades of experience managing classrooms and supporting young people through challenges. His presence added stability and wisdom to the volunteer team, but he was careful not to position himself as an authority figure in a space that operated through collaborative leadership. Robert's insights about the connection between education and community development resonated strongly with William's long-standing interest in educational issues, but Robert's perspective was grounded in day-to-day classroom experience rather than policy analysis or academic research. He had seen firsthand how students' academic performance was affected by family stress, housing instability, and food insecurity. He had also witnessed the remarkable resilience that young people demonstrated when they felt supported by caring adults and connected to meaningful community activities. As the afternoon preparation continued, William and Catherine began to see how Hope Haven functioned as an informal educational environment where people of all ages learned from each other. Volunteers developed practical skills like cooking, budgeting, and conflict resolution, but they also gained deeper understanding about social issues, cultural differences, and effective communication across various barriers. The center's approach to education was entirely different from formal academic settings. There were no curricula or assessments, no grades or certificates. Instead, learning emerged naturally from shared work and conversation. People taught each other based on their own experiences and expertise, creating a rich environment for mutual education that honored different types of knowledge and skill. This organic learning community had produced remarkable outcomes over the years. Several former guests had been inspired to pursue formal education or job training programs after developing confidence and motivation through their involvement with Hope Haven. Volunteers had discovered new career interests and developed leadership abilities that served them in other areas of their lives. The center had become a place where people could experiment with different roles and responsibilities without the high-stakes pressure of formal employment or academic performance. Catherine was particularly interested in how the center supported parents in developing skills and resources for their families. She met several mothers who had initially come to Hope Haven because they were struggling to provide adequate nutrition for their children. Through their involvement with the center, they had learned about cooking techniques, budgeting strategies, and nutrition information that helped them maximize their food resources. But more importantly, they had built relationships with other parents facing similar challenges, creating informal networks of mutual support that extended well beyond the center itself. These parent networks had become self-sustaining communities that shared childcare responsibilities, job information, housing opportunities, and emotional support during difficult times. Margaret explained that some of Hope Haven's most important work happened in these informal relationships that developed among community members, connections that might never have formed without the center providing an initial gathering place and shared purpose. The afternoon also brought William and Catherine into contact with some of Hope Haven's more complex success stories. They met David, a man in his 30s who had been homeless for several years before connecting with the center. David's journey back to stable housing and employment had not been straightforward. He had faced setbacks and challenges that had tested both his own determination and the community's commitment to supporting him through difficult times. What struck William about David's story was how it illustrated the limitations of traditional approaches to homelessness that focused primarily on providing temporary shelter and basic services. David's recovery had required sustained relationships with people who believed in his potential even when he struggled to believe in it himself. It had required patience from volunteers and staff who continued to welcome him even when his behavior was sometimes difficult or disruptive. Most importantly, it had required recognition that David's homelessness was connected to complex trauma and mental health challenges that couldn't be addressed through housing assistance alone. David now worked part-time at a local warehouse and lived in a small flat not far from Hope Haven. He continued to volunteer at the center several times a week, both because he wanted to give back and because his relationships there remained central to his sense of stability and purpose. His presence at Hope Haven served as inspiration for other guests who were facing similar challenges, but it also reminded everyone involved that recovery and growth were ongoing processes rather than destinations that could be permanently reached. Catherine was moved by how naturally David had been integrated into the volunteer team, with no distinction made between his role and those of volunteers who had never experienced homelessness themselves. This integration reflected Hope Haven's fundamental philosophy that everyone had valuable contributions to make, regardless of their personal circumstances or histories. As the afternoon progressed, William and Catherine began to understand that their morning experience had been just a glimpse into a much larger and more complex community ecosystem. Hope Haven operated 7 days a week, with different programs and activities throughout each day. There were support groups for people dealing with various challenges, workshops on practical skills like resume writing and interview techniques, and social activities that brought people together around shared interests rather than shared problems. The center also served as an informal community center for the broader neighborhood, hosting cultural celebrations, political discussions, and artistic activities that drew participants from throughout the area. This broader programming helped ensure that Hope Haven was seen not as a charity serving needy people, but as a community resource that enriched the lives of everyone who participated. Margaret explained that this integration with the broader community had been essential to Hope Haven's sustainability and effectiveness. When the center was viewed as an asset to the neighborhood rather than a social service facility, it attracted volunteer support and community investment that helped it weather financial challenges and political changes. Local businesses provided donations and job opportunities, schools sent student volunteers, and residents participated in fundraising activities not out of charitable obligation, but because they valued what Hope Haven contributed to their community's quality of life. As evening approached, William and Catherine realized that their day at Hope Haven had given them insights that would take weeks or months to fully process and integrate into their understanding of their roles and responsibilities. They had witnessed community organizing at its most effective and inspiring, but they had also been confronted with the limitations of individual and community responses to systemic social problems. As the evening meal service began, Margaret invited William and Catherine to participate in one final activity that she hoped would crystallize their understanding of Hope Haven's impact. She asked them to help serve the evening meal, but this time she wanted them to focus specifically on listening to the conversations happening around the dinner tables and observing the social dynamics that made this community gathering different from simply providing food to people who needed it. The evening crowd included many people they had met earlier in the day, but there were also newcomers and regular guests who only attended evening services due to work schedules or personal preferences. The atmosphere was more relaxed than the morning service had been, with people lingering over their meals and engaging in extended conversations that ranged from practical matters like job searches and housing concerns to discussions about current events, family celebrations, and personal dreams. Catherine found herself drawn to a table where 3 generations of women were sharing a meal together. The eldest was Mary, a grandmother in her 70s who had been coming to Hope Haven for several years since her husband died, and her pension proved insufficient for both rent and food. Her daughter Janet worked 2 part-time cleaning jobs but still struggled to support her own teenage daughter Emma, whose academic achievements had earned her a place at university, but whose family couldn't afford the associated costs. What struck Catherine about this family's situation was how their challenges were interconnected with broader economic and social policies that affected millions of British families. Mary's inadequate pension reflected decades of gender-based wage discrimination that had prevented her from building sufficient retirement savings. Janet's inability to find full-time employment with benefits illustrated the impact of an economy increasingly dependent on flexible but insecure work arrangements. Emma's struggle to access higher education despite her academic merit highlighted the ways that educational opportunities remained tied to family economic resources. Yet despite these systemic barriers, Catherine observed how the 3 women supported each other with love, humor, and practical assistance that enabled them to maintain their dignity and work toward their goals. Mary used her volunteer time at Hope Haven to develop new social connections and a sense of purpose after the isolation that had followed her husband's death. Janet had connected with other working parents through the center and had found both emotional support and practical help with childcare and job searching. Emma had been inspired by meeting Hope Haven volunteers who had pursued higher education later in their lives, and she had found mentors who helped her navigate university applications and financial aid processes. William spent the evening working closely with Marcus, a volunteer coordinator who managed the complex logistics of running multiple meal services each day while ensuring that the center maintained its welcoming, community-centered atmosphere. Marcus had a remarkable ability to anticipate potential problems and address them before they disrupted the social dynamics of the space. He knew which guests preferred to sit alone and which ones benefited from being invited to join group conversations. He could identify when someone was having a particularly difficult day and needed extra attention or privacy. Marcus explained to William that effective community organizing required both big-picture vision and minute-by-minute attention to interpersonal dynamics. Hope Haven succeeded because it operated according to clear values and principles, but it also succeeded because staff and volunteers were skilled at reading social cues and responding appropriately to individual needs and personalities. This combination of systematic thinking and emotional intelligence was essential for creating spaces where people from diverse backgrounds and circumstances could come together as equals. Through his work with Marcus, William began to appreciate the sophisticated management skills required to operate a community center like Hope Haven. The work involved elements of social work, event planning, conflict resolution, financial management, volunteer coordination, and relationship building. Yet it was rarely recognized as professional expertise because it happened within a nonprofit community setting rather than in a corporate or government context. William found himself thinking about the leadership development opportunities available to young people in his position compared to the practical education in community organizing that volunteers like Marcus had received through their involvement with Hope Haven. His own preparation for future royal responsibilities had included extensive formal education and carefully structured apprenticeships, but he wondered whether he would have learned different but equally valuable skills by spending more time in grassroots community settings. As the evening progressed, Catherine and William both noticed how naturally guests and volunteers moved between different roles and responsibilities. People who had been served dinner helped clear tables and wash dishes. Longtime volunteers sought advice from newer community members who had expertise in areas like technology or healthcare. Children helped elderly guests navigate the food line while receiving patient instruction about proper serving techniques. This fluid exchange of assistance and expertise challenged conventional assumptions about who had knowledge and skills to share versus who needed help and support. Catherine realized that many of her royal engagements had been structured around the assumption that she was there to provide support or recognition to people who were serving others. But Hope Haven operated according to a different model where everyone was understood to have both something to give and something to receive. The evening meal service also provided William and Catherine with an opportunity to observe Hope Haven's approach to addressing behavioral challenges and interpersonal conflicts. During their time at the center, they witnessed several situations where guests or volunteers struggled with communication difficulties, mental health symptoms, or social dynamics that could have disrupted the community atmosphere. In each case, Margaret and other experienced volunteers responded with patience and skill that de-escalated potential problems while preserving everyone's dignity. They had clearly developed strategies for maintaining boundaries and expectations while also accommodating the reality that people facing significant stress and trauma might not always be able to meet conventional social standards. Catherine was particularly impressed by how the community handled a situation where one guest became argumentative and disruptive during dinner. Rather than asking the person to leave or calling security, Margaret and two other volunteers gently engaged him in conversation that helped him express his frustrations more constructively. They acknowledged his concerns while redirecting his energy toward collaborative problem-solving rather than conflict. The situation was resolved without anyone feeling humiliated or excluded, and the overall community atmosphere remained welcoming and positive. This approach to conflict resolution reflected Hope Haven's understanding that people's behavior often reflected their circumstances rather than their character. Someone who seemed angry or difficult might be responding to housing insecurity, health problems, bureaucratic frustrations, or other stresses that would challenge anyone's emotional equilibrium. The community's response was to address underlying needs and concerns rather than simply managing surface-level symptoms. As the evening meal service concluded and volunteers began cleaning up, Margaret asked William and Catherine to join her for a final conversation about what they had observed and learned during their day at Hope Haven. She was curious about their reflections and interested in their thoughts about how the center's approach might connect with their own work and responsibilities. Catherine found herself struggling to articulate the depth of how the experience had affected her. She had always tried to approach her charitable work with genuine care and attention, but her day at Hope Haven had shown her the difference between visiting communities as a royal patron and working alongside community members as a collaborator and learner. She had discovered aspects of British society that she had not fully understood despite years of official briefings and formal presentations. William was equally moved, but was thinking about the practical implications of what they had learned. He wondered whether there were ways to incorporate Hope Haven's approach into existing royal charitable work, or whether that would fundamentally change the nature of both the community organizing and the royal involvement. He was also thinking about the policy implications of what they had witnessed and how grassroots community insights might inform broader social and economic reforms. Both William and Catherine realized that their day at Hope Haven had raised more questions than it had answered, but these were productive questions that would enrich their understanding of their roles. Margaret led William and Catherine to a quiet corner of the dining hall where the evening light filtered through tall windows, casting gentle shadows across the now empty tables. The day's activities had left them physically tired but emotionally energized, and both felt reluctant to return to the formal protocols that awaited them back at Kensington Palace. Margaret sensed their internal struggle and spoke with the wisdom of someone who had guided many people through transformative experiences. She began by acknowledging that their day at Hope Haven had probably challenged many assumptions about poverty, community, and service that they had held before arriving that morning. This was always difficult, she explained, because it required people to reconsider not just their understanding of social issues, but also their understanding of themselves and their roles in addressing those issues. The discomfort they might be feeling was a natural part of learning and growth. Catherine found herself thinking about the hundreds of charitable engagements she had participated in over the years, and she felt a mixture of gratitude for those experiences and regret that they had often kept her at a distance from the realities that people like Margaret addressed every day. She shared with Margaret her realization that much of her charitable work had been structured around her giving to others rather than learning from others, and she wondered how she might change that dynamic in future engagements. Margaret responded, thoughtfully, explaining that Hope Haven had taught her that the most effective service happened when people moved beyond the helper-helped relationship toward genuine partnership and mutual learning. This didn't mean that everyone had identical resources or capabilities to contribute, but it did mean recognizing that everyone had valuable perspectives and experiences that could benefit the community as a whole. For someone in Catherine's position, this might mean spending more time listening to community members before developing charitable initiatives. It might mean supporting grassroots organizations that emerged from within communities rather than always creating new programs designed from outside. Most importantly, it might mean using her platform to amplify community voices rather than always being the primary spokesperson for social causes. William was grappling with different but related questions about how his experience at Hope Haven might influence his future role as monarch. The constitutional constraints on royal political involvement meant that he couldn't directly advocate for specific policy changes, but his day at the center had shown him how much he could learn from engaging directly with community-based solutions to social problems. Margaret suggested that William consider how he might create more opportunities for grassroots community leaders to share their insights with policymakers and institutional leaders. His position would give him unique access to government officials, business leaders, and international organizations that could benefit from understanding community-based approaches to social challenges. Rather than simply advocating for specific solutions, he could facilitate conversations between people who were developing innovative approaches and people who had resources or authority to support or scale those approaches. As their conversation continued, Margaret shared some of the challenges that grassroots organizations like Hope Haven faced in sustaining their work over time. Funding was always a concern, but equally challenging was maintaining community ownership and direction while accepting support from larger institutions that often wanted to impose their own priorities and methods. Many community organizations had been co-opted or fundamentally changed when they accepted grants or partnerships that came with requirements that contradicted their original values and approaches. This led to a discussion about how people with resources and influence could support community organizing without undermining its authenticity and effectiveness. Margaret explained that the most helpful support often came from people who were willing to follow community leadership rather than directing it. This meant providing resources without strings attached, amplifying community voices without speaking for communities, and using their own networks and platforms to create opportunities for grassroots leaders rather than representing them. Catherine, Asked about Hope Haven's relationship with local government officials and larger charitable organizations, Margaret described a complex landscape where some institutional relationships had been beneficial, while others had been frustrating or counterproductive. The center had learned to be strategic about which partnerships to pursue and how to maintain their independence and community focus while accessing resources from larger institutions. Some of their most successful partnerships had been with organizations that shared Hope Haven's values and were willing to support their work without trying to control it. They had also developed good relationships with local government officials who understood that community-based organizations often achieved better outcomes than top-down programs because they were more responsive to local needs and more trusted by community members. But Margaret also shared stories of partnerships that had ended badly when institutional partners had tried to impose their own agendas or had withdrawn support when Hope Haven's community-driven approach didn't align with their expectations or requirements. These experiences had taught the center to prioritize relationships with supporters who respected their autonomy and understood their approach rather than simply seeking support from organizations with the largest budgets or highest profiles. As the evening deepened, William and Catherine realized that their conversation with Margaret was helping them process not just what they had learned about community organizing, but also what they had learned about themselves and their own potential for growth and change. They had arrived at Hope Haven that morning thinking they were there to observe and learn about other people's work. They were leaving with a deeper understanding of how their own roles and responsibilities might be transformed by what they had experienced. The emotional weight of this realization began to settle over both of them. William felt tears forming in his eyes as he thought about the gap between the formal royal training he had received and the profound human connections he had witnessed throughout the day. He had always taken his future responsibilities seriously, but he had understood them primarily in terms of duty and service rather than relationship and mutual learning. Catherine was similarly moved as she reflected on the authentic community she had experienced at Hope Haven compared to the more structured and hierarchical relationships that characterized much of her royal life. She had felt more genuinely useful and connected during her morning serving breakfast than she had during many formal charitable events that had received much more public attention and recognition. Margaret watched their emotional responses with understanding and compassion. She had seen many people experience similar reactions when they first encountered community organizing that challenged their assumptions about power, service, and social change. The tears in their eyes reflected not just sadness about previous limitations in their understanding, but also hope about future possibilities for more meaningful engagement. She gently reminded them that their emotional responses were signs of growth and learning rather than indications that their previous work had been worthless or misguided. Everyone approached service and community engagement from within the constraints of their circumstances and understanding. What mattered was their willingness to continue learning and growing, and their commitment to using whatever influence and resources they had in ways that genuinely supported community well-being. As they prepared to leave Hope Haven, Margaret presented William and Catherine with a simple gift: 2 volunteer aprons embroidered with the center's logo and their first names. She explained that these were tokens of their membership in the Hope Haven community and that they would always be welcome to return not as royal visitors but as volunteer community members. The significance of this gesture was not lost on either William or Catherine. Throughout their lives, they had received countless ceremonial gifts and honorary titles that recognized their status and position. Margaret's gift acknowledged something different: their potential for genuine contribution to community work that had nothing to do with their royal titles and everything to do with their willingness to show up and participate as equals. As they walked toward the exit, both William and Catherine carried with them a profound sense that something fundamental had shifted in their understanding of what it meant to serve others. They had experienced community organizing at its most authentic and effective, and they had glimpsed possibilities for their own roles that went far beyond traditional royal charitable work. The door that had opened to welcome them into Hope Haven that morning had revealed not just a remarkable community organization, but also new possibilities for their own growth and service. As they stepped back into their car for the drive back to their official responsibilities, both knew that they would never be quite the same. The tears in their eyes reflected the magnitude of what they had learned and the weight of responsibility they felt to honor that learning in their future work and lives.